We are going to start now, and this panel will go until 1:40. Okay. So you get 40 minutes instead of 45.
That's cool.
And then we will take the break that I said we were not going to take because I was reminded that breaks are a human right. And so we're going to take the break, but there is no right to a full 15-minute break. So we're going to break from, we'll take our break at about 2:50 or something like that, and it'll be a 10-minute break instead of a 15-minute break. Does that satisfy everyone? All right. So I'm going to get out of the way, but I'm going to let both Darshan and Carlton introduce themselves. I have already started having a conversation with my good attorney here on water, because that happens to be one of the things that I'm really excited about as a Marine, because we spend a lot of time trying to get water to people in areas that don't have water without killing the kids, because Marines always want to give them candy and high-protein stuff, and they haven't had any food. So I will turn it over to you all. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, nice to see everybody. Good afternoon. I just want to say how grateful I am to be here. I've been working with the Committee on Human Rights for a while now, and not just me, other folks from the New Voices program at the National Academies have really had a great time over the last several years working with folks. I'm at Arizona State University. My name is Darshan Karwat, and I've been there for about 7.5 years, running a lab called Reengineered. And basically what we're trying to do is embed ideas of environmental protection, social justice, peace, and human rights in engineering. And what that looks like is all over the place. There's philosophical questions, practical projects. We're working with students, engineering firms, academics, community groups. I'm just so grateful to be here and be in conversation with Professor Waterhouse, who is at Howard University in the law school, where he runs the Center for Environmental and Climate Justice, and most recently was also part of the Biden administration in the Environmental Protection Agency, working at was the director of the Office of Land and Emergency Management. What we're wanting to talk about is this intersection between human rights, climate change, climate justice, and we'll just have a conversation, and it's open to the audience to ask questions as well. I'll probably draw on you as the conversation proceeds. But let's just start with you, Dr. Waterhouse. What got you involved in the work that you do, whatever that means to you?
Yeah, thanks so much for that question. It's a great question. It actually has a number of components. I'm going to try to give you some highlights. So when I was growing up in the 70s, my mother was a big fan of Ralph Nader and some of the consumer advocacy work and public good work he was doing at that time. And I saw that as something that seemed like a good way to engage in the world when I heard about it. I also grew up in the shadow of a smokestack, so we can look out our house window and we can see a smokestack a couple of blocks away. And I think those were seeds. Mm-hmm. I then went to Penn State, where I was studying electrical engineering and doing a pretty poor job of it. But I was looking for ways to help my cumulative average, and I heard about science, technology, and society. And so this was, for me, an interesting way to engage, because it connected back with the seeds from when I was young and heard about this idea of engaging in the world in a way to help and protect people. And when I engaged in this science, technology, and society, I did it as a minor of studies, and that was important for me, but it was mostly there at that time to lay seeds. Again, it was just mostly seeds. I wasn't really sure. It just was fun classes, classes I really was interested in, unlike the engineering classes, and classes that I was able to thrive in. So I got all the way up through my senior year of college, and then I told my mom, I think I'm going to go on to law school. And I
Did you complete your engineering degree?
You're getting ahead of me.
Okay, all right, okay.
So I told her, I think I'm going to go on to law school. And I said, I had been pushing against law school. My father had been telling me since I was 5 years old, you should be a lawyer. And so obviously I was not going to be a lawyer. And so, I said, I think I've decided to go on to law school because I find that my work on campus as an activist, I was involved in the anti-apartheid movement, very much engaged in organizing around stopping racial discrimination on campus. And, that kind of work fueled me. It excited me. It energized me. This was work I felt that was really important to make the world a better place for people and to help people in need. And so in doing that work, I was pulled toward law because it seemed like it would be a space where I could have room to engage more deeply in that. And that really kind of came to a real 360-degree moment because when I decided to switch to law, I had a horrible cumulative average because of all of my poor performance in engineering, which I ultimately switched over to general arts and sciences because I was recruited by a faculty member at Howard University School of Law because I did very well on the LSAT, and he said that they saw something in me that was promising. And I said, I don't really see where that's coming from because if you look at my average, it's like 2.23 or something like that. And he said, yeah, those are engineering courses, but you had this minor where you had straight A's. And it seems like you might have some capacity if you redirect your energies and your focus. So they offered me a full tuition and scholarship, and a stipend, rather, I should say, to go to school. So I was like, okay, well, I could go back and do another semester to see if I could raise my cum in my major to graduate in engineering, or I could go into law school. Okay, so I'm a lawyer today. All right, so that being said, the way this ultimately comes to fruition is that I was looking for an area of practice that would bridge my real interest in science and engineering along with my legal degree, and that led me into environmental law. Because it seemed like a space where I was working with how technology had caused problems that people were dealing with, which was a lot of what my STS work was about. But then it also was a space where I was able to connect and relate because I was mostly dealing with scientists and engineers. And I found in that a third wheel that came back around, which connected me back with my youth, which was this idea of justice. So I heard a talk about environmental justice when I was early in my law school career, and they were explaining that there's not only the problem with our lack of harmony with the ecosystem and with the environments in which we live, but also with one another, and the way that the effects of our pollution on the planet are not equally distributed so that everyone suffers the same harms, but that certain groups are really bearing the burden for all of us. And so that seemed like a cause that I was really interested in championing, and that kind of led me to where I am really today.
So we heard a lot this morning about ideas of engineering, ideas of human rights. What are your reflections on the intersections between engineering and human rights?
So I'm going to link that back to another story. So when I went to Howard, I was looking at a range of law schools, and I went to Howard ultimately because I was really impressed with the civil rights legacy of the law school and the work of Charles Hamilton Houston, who said that a lawyer is either a social engineer or a parasite on society. And right? And that kind of framing really made me think about law not as an opportunity for me so much to kind of make money, but as a space for me to help problem solve. And when I was in engineering, one of the things I didn't get a lot. I didn't get differential equations, I didn't get chemistry, but what I did get was that engineering was about training us to be problem solvers. And that's what I was looking to see happen in my law degree, is that I would help to solve problems, social problems. Not so much technical problems like how do we make this iPhone work in a concrete building, right? But social problems. How do we, engage in our practices and our professions in ways that lift up and enhance other people's lives rather than knocks them off the train or pushes them over into a ditch? And so that really is how I began to frame and think about these issues. I was fortunate to study with a woman named Golda Butcher, who is a phenomenal woman in the human rights space and former professor at Howard University. And she introduced me to the idea of international human rights. And I think it's so core because in many ways what's been said about our world today is that the way we've put each other in silos has kept us from solving a lot of problems that we really need to solve. And it's because, no, I'm told, you're an electrical engineer. All I really want you to do is solve the problem of making this algorithm run faster. Not all the consequences of it, not what it's designed to do, but a very small segmented problem. And that kind of segmentation and divorcing or abstracting of the engineering and scientific knowledge and expertise away from the actual lives that people live is deeply problematic. Running the Office of Land and Emergency Management, one of the things I came to learn about was the legacy of pollution. In the Office of Land and Emergency Management, you're responsible for cleaning up pollutants. So toxic waste sites under Superfund, hazardous waste under Resource Conservation Recovery Act. And what I came to learn is that we're still cleaning up the pollution from the 30s. The Department of Energy, in particular, has vast legacy waste sites that one of them, Hanford, costs $250 million a year on cleanup and won't be cleaned up in the next 10 or 15 years using $250,000 a year.
Billion.
That's
quarter of a
$250 million a year.
Yeah.
And that's just one site from one department, right? The mining that took place to fuel our national security interests in World War II produced, just in one example, on Navajo Nation, over 500 abandoned uranium mines that have not been cleaned up. Now, when I hear people tell me we've got an urgency that we have to address for critical minerals, we need these critical minerals so we can go forward and create a better future. I'm thinking, wait a minute, we didn't clean up the last emergency that we had to do to make sure that everybody was going to be safe from Nazi Germany. How do we have these initiatives that are so divorced from the consequences that they cause? And I think part of it is because we don't bring engineers and scientists, many of who I find to be deeply ethical people, we don't bring that ethics to bear in what the products are going to be doing or what they're being used for. So I think it's essential that there is almost a code of ethics for engineers, that they're going to be as committed to thinking about the consequences of what they're engineering as they are about the data that they're using, right? Those ethical standards are essential for our future. Most of the problems that we're dealing with that are cataclysmic today are all human-caused problems, right? Whether we're talking about climate change, whether we're talking about exposure to pollution, whether we're talking about a heat island effect coming from climate change, severe weather, wildfires, all these are consequences of our decisions. And unfortunately, most of these are the consequences of decisions related to science and engineering. The industrialization of American society produced great wealth and also great prosperity and allowed a lot of people to eat. So I don't miss the fact that these engineering and scientific decisions have been used primarily with the idea of enhancing, right, human flourishing. But on the bottom side of that human flourishing coin, when you flip it over, are the people who are living with toxic waste every day. The people whose lives have been forgotten. In that success story, we're not telling the story of all the people who are dying, 100,000 people from air pollution in America per year, 1 million people in the world. How do we count those successes of our engineering and technology with the necessity to protect people who we're supposedly doing all that science and technology for, right? So I think integration of international convention on civil and political rights, which the United States is both, right, signed and ratified, which has a right to life, right, tells us a right to life, and as the comment on Article 6 says by the UN, right to life includes the environment, right? So absolutely, when we're coming up with those solutions, we essentially have to have engineers and sciences engaged in not only how to solve technical problems, but how to solve human problems that these technologies may actually be causing, or furthering, or exacerbating.
So you used the word justice You use the word human rights.
Yeah.
In the U.S., it seems to me that ideas of justice tend to be more prevalent in discourse, right? Environmental justice, energy justice. We can think about the massive federal funding of projects under the guise of environmental justice over the last few years. What would you say are the overlaps and differences between these two ideas, particularly because, again, human rights might not be something top of mind. Thinking about issues through a human rights lens might not be top of mind in the United States.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think they get after the same thing, right? So the nice thing about the human rights discourse is it allows us to think at an individual level about where the floor is for everyone, right? It kind of, to me, represents the floor that governments promise they won't go below in the way they engage with people, and also the floor at which governments promise they will protect people from treatment by others that can be harmful. Right, that floor is essential for being able to say nobody goes below here, and we have a standard and a norm that we believe in. I think the justice context fits a little more in the American society out of our own just history of thinking about exclusion and how that exclusion perpetrates certain injustices upon groups based on your group identity. And the fact that the United States is not always, out there is not always a big fan of the United Nations. Mm-hmm. And so therefore, these international treaties and international conventions often are not at the top of mind of the way we talk about how to protect people in the United States. For example, the Sustainable Development Goals, right, and sustainable development. I think sustainable development is an excellent way to integrate this idea of international human rights and justice. So I did an article recently looking at social dominance theory and environmental justice to talk about how the Brundtland Report, Our Common Future, right, from 1987, lays out the idea of sustainable development. And I think that's essential also when we're talking about engineering and science, that people are thinking about their engineering solutions and scientific solutions in ways that are sustainable. And what the Brundtland Report does is when it talks about sustainability, it actually doesn't talk about justice, and it doesn't talk about international human rights. It talks about equity. And it establishes equity is a foundational aspect of sustainability. Because sustainability is not just how humans are able to be in harmony, more harmonious with nature and ecology, but also how we can be in better relationship with one another. And that if you don't have the humans working together or in a good relationship, or you have vast inequities in their experiences, humans trash the environment. Right? And so it's not really sustainable if it's not politically sustainable. We can all see examples and think about examples of how human conflict destroys the environment, right? It makes the water polluted, the air polluted, right? The land legacy of waste and contamination. And so when we think about sustainable development, we have to think about it in a way that people's human rights are recognized and honored, and also think about it in a way that we produce just outcomes. No one should have to bear the burdens of a society's pollution because they're a member of this or that group. And that's all environmental justice is really about.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything unique about how climate change interacts with human rights and international human rights law and the role that engineering plays, particularly because over the last several years there have been legal cases that have been brought against fossil fuel companies, for example, and we basically see a litany of losses on the part of people who are trying to hold firms accountable. Now, that's just one way in which people are trying to think about addressing climate change or holding people accountable. Overall, though, is there something unique from your perspective about this, about how climate change interacts with engineering and human rights and law and regulation and so on?
Unique to some degree, but not ultimately unique, because the whole creation of our environmental kind of protection regime in the United States, and I dare say the world, was a recognition that industrialization has these adverse consequences that have been produced, right? So like, rivers on fire, inversion events in Dornoga, Pennsylvania, smog in California, all of these, and Love Canal in New York, right? All of these environmental catastrophes that we saw, Rachel Carson is telling us about Silent Spring. and DDT. All of these kind of consequences that were being seen in the late 60s and early 70s caused people to say, hey, what the heck are we doing? We've got to do something to clean this place up. We've got to put some laws in place, put some breakers on what's happening, because industrialization from 70 forward, like it happened from 1870 forward, we'll trash the place, right? So there's a recognition, and there's a movement, and then that calls for political organizing, and that leads to a Republican government deciding they're going to found the EPA, right? And setting it on its course to protect human health in the environment. So I really do think that climate change is not new in that we've been here before. It's just a new application of what we already are dealing with. These are big problems, whether it's nationwide or regional, now it's global. But before climate change, we had the Montreal Protocol to try to help deal with a thinning ozone layer. And fortunately, the world was able to come together and find some solutions to that to decrease that phenomenon in a way that was really important and helpful. But with climate, there's been such a big pushback from certain industries that we just haven't made the same kind of progress. And I think we need engineers and scientists to help us do two primary things. I'm not going to start with mitigation. The reason I don't start with mitigation is because I am deeply committed to environmental justice. And I recognize that right now, focusing on saving the planet through mitigation forgets the fact that the planet is already destroyed for some people as soon as that wildfire burns down their whole community, as soon as that hurricane wipes out everybody in the neighborhood, as soon as that heat island effect costs the lives of their parents and their grandparents, right? For them, you're not trying to save the future, you're trying to save the present. And so we have to lean in on resilience and adaptation, because there are people right now who are already dying from climate change. And so if we're only focused on stopping people from dying in 50 years, we're neglecting, again, the people who are most vulnerable today. So one, we need engineers and scientists who will do it in their jobs or do it in their off time to really focus on helping us design the resilient, adaptive societies and places, particularly for the most vulnerable communities, right? What are the systems that need to be in place to prevent heat island effect from killing so many people? What do we have to do in our design to make that marginalized communities in low-lying areas aren't wiped out when there's a hurricane? What do we do to make sure that what we saw in Hawaii with the wildfires, where it's completely unexpected, doesn't just become a devastating way that people are completely wiped out? Those are the things that we need engineers and scientists to do first, I would say. And then I know the big money item is mitigation, so people are already going to be doing that, right? But that's the other thing we need. We don't want these consequences we're already seeing for some to ultimately be the experience of all. So we need people to focus on engineering designs for solutions to mitigation. But those designs, we need to think about them in a way that they can be equitably distributed. Not so that we're just taking communities that already have the burden of the polluting facilities and deciding to put, carbon sequestration, utilization, and storage in those communities that are already suffering the burdens and the risk associated with pollution. So we're going to have to design some of those mitigation efforts in a way that wealthy communities will be happy to have them. Wouldn't that be nice? Right? Because the truth is, if a wealthy community is happy to have it, it probably is okay for the poor communities too. Right? But if it's designed that it's only good enough for the poor communities, it's probably not good enough. So we need engineers and scientists who are thinking about how to ethically create the kind of world they want to live in, whatever neighborhood they happen to be in.
So for years now, there have been attempts to try to get let's say a firm wanting to build a project, needing to get a permit from a federal agency or a state agency. There have been requirements for them to do different kinds of analyses to understand what the impacts might be on particular communities and so on. Oftentimes, those kinds of analyses, particularly ones that account for environmental injustice considerations or environmental justice considerations, are done in a way that feels a little checkboxy. So what kinds of analyses do you think are actually helpful for engineers and scientists to adequately account for the range of possible impacts of a project. And the reason why I ask this is because engineering inevitably becomes part of the political process, right? A project is a political phenomenon, right? And so, X group produces one analysis that shows some kind of environmental injustice, and another group will come in and contest everything that was said in that, right? You have your facts, I have my facts. So is that inevitable? So question one again, what kinds of analyses are helpful? And is contestation around those kinds of analyses that could adequately account for these kinds of issues that you're talking about always contestable?
So first, I'll start with the idea that I think the National Environmental Policy Act gives us a lot in that it lays out a framework anytime there's going to be a federal project for analysis through the environmental impact statement. And so sometimes I think there's cheating that happens where there's going to be a significant impact on the human environment, but they say there won't be, so they do an environmental assessment that has a minimum standard only and doesn't really get at the big issues. And so then they just kind of bypass the whole thing. But as long as the environmental impact statement is done, NEPA has done the Council on Environmental Quality has done important work through their regulations. In the last year or so, they've integrated environmental justice into the NEPA analysis, right? And that language of kind of calling for that kind of analysis is now regulatorily required, not just required as a matter of like, this is good government policy. So that's one. Two, where environmental justice analysis is today is so far ahead of where it was when I started working on this back in the early 1990s. So we have the GIS data, we have all this mapping data, and so cumulative impacts is the analysis I would say that we need to see happen. Because the silos, again, had caused historically analysis to only say, what about this, what about this, what about this, not really focusing people on what are the consequences of having this permit and this permit and this permit and exposure to this already in the soils and this already existing kind of health baseline. And so I think a cumulative impact analysis is a really critical way to help address environmental justice. And I'm hopeful that this is where we get as a country, that we look back and say, oh, we should have always thought about this, right? Because all we're saying is that human beings' sickness and well-being and health is not bifurcated based on whether the pollution's in the air, water, or soil. We're like one unit that it's impacted multiple ways from multiple directions, and all of those impacts should be part of every decision, right? And so I think cumulative impacts, and Charles Lee, working at the Environmental Justice, Office of Environmental Justice at the Environmental Protection Agency, is working really hard to come up with a model that EPA can announce and put forward on how cumulative impacts will take place. I don't know if this is going to happen under the current administration, because I've heard people, under the new administration, because I've heard people who are associated with that administration say they want to get rid of a cumulative impacts discussion. But I think it's a critical way to move forward. Mm-hmm. And in terms of contestation, I think contestation is okay. The question is, does it produce a paralysis, right? Mm-hmm. So we all are, those of us who are involved in the academy know that you can't give a paper without somebody giving you a contrary perspective on it, right? I don't think that necessarily is harmful. Mm-hmm. What's harmful is when contestation leads to, oh, therefore, since somebody has a contrary opinion, therefore your thesis is invalid, right? Mm-hmm. So as long as we have a set of standards that says, the fact that there are people who are critical doesn't eliminate the validity. And the third part of it, I would say, is environmental justice includes justice as recognition that was acknowledged earlier by our, I think, virtual presenter, and also justice in procedure. So that means that we have to have people from the community who are involved in the decision making, right? Mm-hmm. And there is a source of information and experience that can go a long way. New Jersey gives us a model. Mm-hmm. New Jersey has an environmental justice bill that has become a law, and that environmental justice law gives community members a say, but it also uses an impact analysis that allows us to say, if a community is already overburdened, the state has the authority to veto a permit request. Mm-hmm. That's important, because the fact that we continue to burden communities that are already overburdened says that we're not really interested or focused on the consequences that they're living with every day, as long as we get the benefits that this, activity is going to produce for some of us.
So you gave the example in New Jersey, great example. That kind of law might not exist in much of the rest of the country, for example. And we're also talking about human rights issues that move beyond environmental issues as well, right? So, law and regulation certainly drive engineering and can shape it, but oftentimes there's an absence of it, right? And we might have not just engineering students, but practicing engineers caring about these issues and wanting to do something about it without the backing of the law or regulation. So what does articulating the value of doing this kind of work, human rights related work, environmental, climate justice related work, actually look like in ways that can actually move resources, right? For any project, you need resources, and to get those resources, you need to convince people. You need to convince your boss. You need to convince line management, whatever, right? And again, they might not be required by law to account for these things. So what does articulating the value of doing this work actually look like in ways that convinces people that, yes, I should be supporting this in our firm?
So there's convincing management and then convincing the people on the ground who are doing the work. Let's start with the people on the ground. I would love to see engineers take a position that says these are our standards of conduct that we voluntarily adopt. And these standards of conduct will guide us in the way we perform our profession. And that is a way, I think, that can help inform the management at the top when we have these kinds of norms and ethics that engineers across businesses and organizations have committed to. Because in the same way that lawyers aren't necessarily known as the most ethical people, but there's a set of standards below which there's a floor most of us don't expect lawyers to breach. So we're like, hey, this is confidential. You say that because you expect them to keep it confidential, right? You're my lawyer, I expect you to do something. That's because there's a standard of zealous representation, right? And so there are norms that we can use to help to regulate voluntarily without the law being in place. But it takes members of the profession to commit to those kinds of norms and say, I can work on your project, but I can't do that. If that's what your project is doing, that's outside of my association's norms. And my association is a part of what it means for me to be an engineer. I know that's a tough position, but it would be an excellent way to help raise the level of ethical norms of our businesses if they have those kinds of standards that they're hearing from their expertise and their subject matter experts. Mm-hmm. And so meetings like this are critical for helping to raise engineers, understanding of these ethical responsibilities and duties, I think, that exist. And STS, as has already been talked about, in our educational system, if we want to have a better future, it absolutely demands that we have engineers who are breaking a little bit with some unhealthy past experiences to move us forward into a dynamic where technology is going to be beneficial for all. And that becomes a standard that we use, not just a way to kind of produce profits for some.
I certainly have tons more questions. We have a few minutes left. Any questions or comments or pushback? Anything you disagree with? I want to hear disagreement if there's any. Yeah.
Contestation's
so I saw
inevitable,
your hand
right?
up first, and then we'll move to the front. Yeah.
Thanks a lot for a super interesting. Thanks so much for a super interesting conversation discussion. So actually, the very last point about the need for codes. So the IEEE has a code of ethics. The ASME has a code of ethics. So is your claim that there's not sufficient professionalization of new members or integration? Because they have the codes, I guess, but they're ineffective.
Well, say a couple of things. So one would be, to what degree do those codes incorporate these kinds of norms that we're talking about, right? Rather than kind of being just kind of protect the guild, right? These are our standards, and people who act outside of these standards, we don't really kind of associate with them. do those standards include engineering and science in a way that thinks about the human communities that are being impacted by the work that we're doing? If we can get those kinds of things incorporated into those codes, that means a lot. Also, I'm under the impression that those codes are often relate to the professional engineers who are licensed. And so to the degree that we have people who are engineers but aren't part of the professional engineering license group, what happens if they don't follow those codes? Do they even have to follow those codes? And so one would be, can we produce codes where there are none? Two, can we incorporate the kind of norms we want to see, right, to look at the impacts of our behavior and not just kind of the minimal internal looking standards of conduct? And then three, can we see that that becomes a norm across the profession and not just among those who are licensed? Ultimately, professional codes are up to the members of that profession. Most codes, medical codes, legal codes, they're not imposed by a government, right? They rose out of the guild. If we can see that happen, and it absolutely can happen among our engineers and scientists, we can see some transformation happen, and that's what I would be hopeful for.
Okay, yeah, sure, yeah.
Hi, thanks for the great conversation. My name is Enrique Rodriguez. I'm a AAAS fellow in the EPA, and I have an environmental engineering background. And a lot of what I kind of have focused in the past is this idea of green infrastructure to increase resiliency and adaptability, particularly in shrinking cities in the Midwest. But something that I'm concerned about is, in an effort to do good with things like green infrastructure, gentrification kind of comes into play in terms of as we remediate and alleviate the environmental concerns of a community, developers then swoop in and say, hey, this land looks great, it's really cheap, we can invest in it, flip it, and then displace the community, the existing community. So I'm kind of curious about your thoughts on how to mitigate these externalities that result from these efforts.
Okay, great. Yep.
Oh, okay. I'll read one from online really quickly, too, from Nathan Smith. Why is it useful and important for engineers and lawyers to work together on this topic? What can be achieved by having these two specific groups work in collaboration?
One more? Yeah. We'll
Okay, we can do another online. So Ava Malouf asked, do engineers and scientists make unethical decisions because they're unaware of the consequences, or could there be other motives? What about when they work within a larger organization like the DoD or a corporation giving instructions?
Okay, so 3 questions. What does mitigating gentrification look like? What does collaboration between lawyers and engineers look like, and what benefit can be gained there? And the third question is a big one. What does it mean to work in a complex bureaucracy? And how does that affect the possibility of making decisions that may or may not be in line with what is being asked of you?
Great, all great questions. I'll start with the one about green infrastructure because it's something we've looked at. When I was running the office, one of the things that we did was we wanted to see the brownfields program implemented in a way that did less displacement. Because one of the criticisms that was made of the program at its inception was that this program's got a lot of potential, but it also has the potential to have these adverse consequences. And so I said to the staff, we've got to make sure we are prioritizing anti-displacement practices. We like to let people choose. The brownfields program, is basically a cleanup program for sites that are not contaminated enough for the federal government to get involved. They're mostly remediated at the state or local or private citizen level, and the federal government gives grants for that kind of work. And so the federal government scores people's applications for grants. And I said, what we should do is we don't tell people what to build, because we like communities to build what they feel they need. But in setting up the grant, we should have criteria that rewards people who are going to design something that is going to help allow people who live there, who had to endure the pollution while they live there, get the benefit of living in the community when there isn't pollution. So to make it something that does promote anti-displacement. And so I think that has to be an integral part of the way you're thinking about green infrastructure, because while we don't have the ability to control the outcomes, we do have a lot of nudging power, right, through design, right? And so designing programs in a way, and we'll go to the next question, in conjunction with lawyers and with city council and legislators that says, we want to do green infrastructure to help people in this community, but we need to partner with you to help make sure that there are policies that aren't going to force out these elderly residents who've been living here for so long and are on fixed income and now can't afford these rising prices. Can you do something to lock in their tax rate? Can you do something that makes sure that we have a set aside for certain numbers of residents who've been here historically, that they'll be able to retain ownership of the property, right? So there's different ways that we can collaborate between the design of green infrastructure to make it truly sustainable. Because sustainability doesn't just include ecological sustainability, but there's a social sustainability that has to be connected with the law as well as policy. Ultimately, the last question, my call for kind of developing a set of ethical norms is a way of educating institutions, right? I'll use an example. Most of us, when it comes to work, whether we're at McDonald's or whether we're at Northrop Grumman, have certain expectations that we're only going to work so many days a week, that we're only going to work so many hours a day, that if we get hurt on the job, that there's insurance or workman's compensation or certain kinds of things, and that people have to be a certain age in order to work. These expectations don't come out of nowhere. They come explicitly out of the labor movement. And the labor movement being engaged in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, calling for standards that would be necessary for everybody who works there. Because it wasn't the government that just came along and said it, the labor unions demanded it. And then it became a norm, and then it became a law. And so there are ways in which we need engineers and scientists to organize around creating a set of norms that these institutions then will acknowledge and recognize, because this is what our professional staff is calling for. And to the degree that this is what the majority of engineers agrees to, they don't have anybody else they can go to do their engineering work other than engineers.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. And please.
Yeah, thank you.
Just a final word, just one last word, just to close it out.
Okay.
Yeah.
I thought you were saying go.
Oh, no. I'm here, Professor Waterhouse is here to continue the conversation moving forward and also beyond just this gathering. There's tons of really interesting efforts that folks in the audience are running as well, so I really encourage you to try to understand what kinds of programs people are trying to set up and run. There are programs like Project Confluence that we're running at Arizona State, American Geophysical Union's Thriving Earth Exchange, Community Engineering Corps, AAAS's On-Call Scientists, the work of the Union of Concerned Scientists, Engineers Without Borders. There's tons of really, really interesting efforts. I think one thing that is probably worth us doing is figuring out ways to coordinate our efforts as opposed to, recreate or possibly mimic other people's efforts. I'm just continuing to look forward to the progress that we can make together as opposed to kind of starting new things, but instead learning from what other people have done and figure out ways in which we can work together.